So, some of my fam has told me that my Sun and Moon episode was a little bit too stuffy and academic sounding, not sounding like me. So, I was like, all right, yeah, you're right. So, I'm going to redo that one to make it more fitting to my personality. I did write that out as an academic paper style or whatnot. So, it did come off as quite, I don't know, not me. So I'm going to redo that episode. I'm going to use my paper as a guide while I go through this. So, the Sun and the Moon, Hafsa and Ayse. There's a long-standing theory that Hafsa Sultan, the mother of Suleiman the Magnificent, and Ayse Hatun, a Crimean Tatar princess, are actually the same woman. And on paper, it's a great story. Clean, efficient, politically satisfying. It ties the Ottoman dynasty neatly into the Crimean Khaganate and gives Suleiman a mother with a resume that historians can feel good about. It also kind of whitewashes the facts of the period where most of the Sultan's mothers were actually slaves. They were not free women. I think modern historians, especially those who want to promote like everything great and glorious about the Ottoman Empire, they would like to lean into that narrative that yes, Suleiman's mother was a free woman, a Crimean Tatar princess, not a slave concubine. But we all know that this just wasn't very likely for the period, because during that period, sultans did not really marry free women, and there was a reason for that. I'm gonna add that in here. It wasn't in my academic-y style episode, but the reason for that was it actually helped them consolidate power more because they weren't tied to any dynasties or nobility, and they could exert their authority. They didn't have to worry about as many uprisings, like perhaps for example, perhaps a vizier or powerful, influential bey or something like that. They don't necessarily like the sultan, and they can essentially build a power base with the princes or their mothers, perhaps try to overthrow the sultan. There are cases where situations like that did rise up, but it wasn't as effective because of how their princes were not related to any outside power as they were in other periods of Ottoman history, right? So having these slave concubines give birth to their sons generally made the sons less powerful, less able to overthrow their fathers, as we will come to find out is exactly what Selim did when he did marry the Crimean Tatar princess Ayse Hatun, who was not Suleiman's mother. And I will get into that. I will explain that. So unfortunately, the common timeline, except until probably very recently, there are other historians who don't believe that they were the same woman, but it appears to have been written by someone who does not believe in time. So instead of just accepting this very convenient narrative, I did something deeply unreasonable. I did my own research and I checked it out, right? I built out a full family tree for Selim I, his consorts, the marriage with Ayse, the children, their known birth dates and possible birth dates, the marriages of the children, especially the daughters. A lot of times the daughters' marriages were recorded, but their birthdays weren't. So essentially, you can kind of generalize the age, the common age of marriage of the period, and kind of backtrack from that and get a general idea of when they may have been born. Again, it's not like solid fact, right? You're still kind of doing a little bit of guesswork, and you map out this family tree and you say, well, she could be possibly fit into this, or she could possibly have been born in this time. So that means she was possibly this consort's child, maybe. And you just like start to move the pieces around in the family tree, and you can move them around, and you could kind of see patterns develop instead of just accepting the very convenient narrative. So I didn't do all that work because I enjoy suffering, but because once you actually lay these things out, patterns tend to emerge. And by patterns, I mean problems. What you do not get is a smooth, logical progression where one woman gracefully moves through these roles like this is a well-paced historical TV drama. So let's start with the most obvious issue. Ayse Hatun is documented as being married to Shehzada Mehmet, Selim's youngest brother. And the elite women could remarry. So her then marrying Shehzada Selim is not something out of the ordinary per se, but there are a few cultural nuances that might bring it to question as to the timing of this. Because yes, elite women could remarry, and she could marry a brother if that brother... So in Islam, you can marry the sibling of your former spouse if that spouse is no longer living. And it would have especially been even more reasonable because they also didn't have any children. Ayse did not have any children with Shehzada Mehmet. And Shehzada Mehmet did have other children with his concubines, just not with her. So it's possible that maybe she could not have children, or maybe that they just did not have any relations like that, that their marriage was just purely political. So there's two different paths you can go with that, really, especially if you're writing like a historical drama novel or TV series or something like that. So it's just the timing that is questionable, because what is controversial is the amount of time we're apparently supposed to believe all of this took place. Because for this theory to work, Ayse has to be married to Mehmet, outlive the situation, which she does because she becomes a widow, and actually wait the appropriate mourning period after her husband's death to make sure that she's not with child and all of that. Transition to Selim, like move to Selim's court, marry him, and then give birth to Suleiman in 1494. And the date of her marriage to Shehzada Mehmet is documented, so that doesn't make sense in that short window of time, right? It's pretty aggressively optimistic to think that that happened so fast that she could be the mother of Suleiman. And all of Suleiman's full sisters, by the way. At this point, we are no longer dealing with a tight timeline. We're dealing with a timeline that requires everyone involved to move at the speed of panic. And honestly, this doesn't even compliment Selim's personality either. And honestly, she marries Selim way later. It's actually believed that she married Selim sometime right before he deposes his own father and takes the throne, which happens later down the timeline and way after Suleiman is already born. So it just doesn't make sense. And also, you add in the second issue, which is Ottoman reproductive customs. There's a general practice, again, not absolute, but consistent enough, that a concubine typically had one son. And this is especially true before Suleiman's era, because Suleiman is actually known as one of the sultans who broke with that tradition, because when he married Harem Sultan, like actually married her, like freed her, so she was a free woman, she was no longer a slave concubine, then he married her. He actually had a lot of children with her and a lot of sons with her. Before that period, in Suleiman's father's period, this wasn't the norm. In fact, I would say that in the beginning of the Ottoman period, sultans did marry free women and had more than one child with them and all that. But the way the Ottoman system evolved over time was to transition away from that and to only consort with slaves and not marry free women. And that happened like after some of the earlier sultans up until Selim the First. So in Selim's time, it really appears like there was just one son per consort. And then after Harem, it looks like Nurbanu tried to revive that custom. And later on, when I do her novel in the series, we can talk about that and why she would have done that. Because it definitely evolved into something as a way for her to consolidate her own power. So she revived the tradition for that reason, which is kind of different as why that custom was the way it was in Selim's period. In Selim's period, it was for him to consolidate power. But when Nurbanu becomes the Queen Mother, the Valida Sultan, it was so she can consolidate her power and to diminish her son's consort's influence that they might have over him. But after Nurbanu, it became a trend again. Because with Ahmet the First, especially, we see that with Kosim, he does the same. He has multiple sons with Kosim. So there's that. So the second issue was the Ottoman reproductive customs. So the concubine having one son was generally not out of preference. It was out of necessity, the way they saw it in their system, right? And probably the main reason why was that each Shehzada needed his mother to follow him to his provincial post, his sanjak, and to manage his household. We see in Ottoman history that Shehzadas who did not have strong, intelligent, politically shrewd mothers ended up in the grave when the next sultan took the throne. So it was really important for a Shehzada to have his mother with him, to support him, to guide him, and to also manage his household and his harem. Because the harem was part of this massive political system. It wasn't this Orientalist, like, pleasure palace fantasy that some Western Europeans or Americans imagined it, I guess you could say. It was a political machine, is what it was. It was kind of cold and impersonal if you think about it. Like, it was just a machine functioning. Like, the harem was like, you could even describe it as a convent. Most of those women in the harem did not meet the sultan, did not even, speak a word to him. They were there learning to run households of their own, refining their manners, getting educations, because they could possibly be the next mother of the sultan. So they didn't want stupid mothers for their princes. They wanted mothers who were educated and intelligent and smart, that could raise educated and intelligent princes. They didn't want idiots. It wasn't just about being pretty. You had to have brains too. Or the Queen Mother probably would have never put you in front of her son because she didn't want that kind of mother for her grandchild or her grandchildren, because that wasn't the point of the system. The sultan had to be smart. He had to be intelligent. He had to be shrewd. He had to be diplomatic. He had to be strategic. So the whole harem was just a giant educational institution for future sultans, meaning their princes and their mothers, and also the princesses of the blood, because they also had their specific role where they would marry into the noble families, the viziers, to keep the viziers. The point of that was to keep the viziers loyal to the dynasty, make sure they didn't stray off the path of course, sometimes it happened. We see that in history. There's a lot of viziers who were executed too, without a doubt, for conspiring and all kinds of stuff. So it was a system. It was not like some perversion fantasy of like frolicking naked women running around the palace, and the Sultan could just grab one and do whatever he wanted with her. And then like, that's just freaking ridiculous and absurd. And this is why people need to be very careful about thinking what they see on TV or even read in novels. I'm writing a novel too myself. To think that everything in there is actual fact. Because see, my novel as well is there are some stuff that I imagined for the story that's not an actual solid fact, right? Now, I'm trying to make it plausible and to align with actual facts, but I'm taking a lot of liberties writing this story because I want to bring the characters alive. I want them to have personality. I want them to have feelings, emotions, and I want it to all be believable, so I'm doing a lot of research for it. Some writers do more research than others. Some lean more into the extravagant and the super dramatic, and then some lean more into facts. I'm trying to lean more into facts, but also make a really interesting story to keep people engaged. And actually, this is kind of hard because I'm writing it from the first person, like from Hafsa's point of view. And I'm going to do this with each Queen Mother, by the way. So it's kind of hard because you can only tell the story from their perspective, like what they see, what people tell them, like other characters in the books, like what they tell them. So it's really hard. I can't look down and like tell the whole story from everybody's point of view. So it's really hard to do that. For example, right now I'm on the 21st chapter and I'm really trying to get to Suleiman's birth. But I'm having problems like coming up with filler material to make it interesting, also plausible or factual at the same time, and only revealing what Hafsa herself would observe or know. I don't know. It's challenging, but I like it, and I hope that I will not get writer's block and run out of ideas when I get to the other consorts, because I believe there's like 8 Valida sultans during the Sultanate of Women period if we start with Hafsa. So hopefully, yeah, it works out. I don't know. So, as I said, each Shehzada needed his mother to follow him to his sanjak and manage his household. This becomes complicated if she has multiple sons in different locations. I mean, it's impossible because despite the many talents of women and their multitasking abilities, Ottoman women could not be in 2 sanjaks at once. Absolutely not, right? Honestly, if they could, the empire probably would have had significantly less bloodshed whenever it was time for a new sultan to ascend the throne, right? So basically, even if you try to assign multiple major births, including Suleiman, to one woman who is already tied to another prince, the whole structure just is very weak and unlikely. Because essentially, that one woman isn't just moving quickly, she's apparently everywhere, all over the place. And that's just not true. Also, when a mom had more than one son, she would have to choose out of her sons which one she wanted to support for the throne. Then the brother, when he ascended the throne, almost always executed all his brothers. So she would be essentially choosing one son and condemning her other sons to death, which isn't really something any mother could possibly do, unless if you're a psychopath or something. But I don't think that, psychopaths are actually rare, and I don't think the imperial mothers are psychopaths. So there's that. Why does this theory of Suleiman's mother being the Tatar princess survive? It's because it's elegant. It's a nice story. The idea that a Crimean Tatar princess becomes the mother of Suleiman reinforces the Ottoman-Crimean ties in a way that feels narratively satisfying. It's neat. it's meaningful, and it looks good on paper. Reality actually is not obligated to be narratively satisfying. I mean, you kind of want that when you're writing a novel, but it depends. It depends what you're going for. If you're going for something that you want to be more leaning towards fact, which I do, you don't want to go that way. When you're working with fragmentary records, especially for women, it becomes very easy for later historians to start merging identities when names, titles, or roles overlap. At some point, these might be the same person becomes these are definitely the same person, and no one stops to ask whether the timeline agrees, and it does not. Now, here's the interesting part. If you separate Hafsa and Ayse into two different people, everything immediately makes more sense. Ayse Hatun fits perfectly well as a Crimean Tatar noblewoman involved in dynastic marriage politics, first with Shehzada Mehmet and later possibly connected to Selim, especially during his more ambitious phase. Hafsa Sultan, meanwhile, exists independently as Selim's consort and the mother of Suleiman before any of this timeline. So there are no frantic transitions, no overlapping roles, no need to bend time into something that is very likely not possible. Just a sequence of events that behaves like actual time. So at this point, the question becomes less which version is more interesting and more which version requires fewer miracles. Because one version ask us to accept a perfectly arranged political narrative that only works if we ignore time, logistics, and cultural practice. And the other just works. It isn't about rejecting tradition for the sake of it. It is about a very simple standard. If your timeline doesn't hold up under basic scrutiny, it's not a strong argument. It's a hopeful one. And in this case, the hopeful version loses. Hafsa Sultan and Ayse Hatun were not the same woman. They were definitely two separate individuals whose identities were later blended into one because the combined story was more convenient, which, to be fair, is a very human thing to do. It happens all the time, especially in historical novels and TV dramas, these sorts of things. So that's about it. If you guys have any questions or comments, please leave me some comments. I do try to answer everybody who leaves a comment for me. I'm a really small YouTube channel. Basically, I'm a teacher, so I just have my channel for creating like little presentations for students and things like that. But I started researching and writing, so let me know. And thanks for listening.